I'm delighted to be with everyone and to have our wonderful guests with us. When the Boggs Center was founded in 1983, there were 5,942 people living in developmental centers, public institutions, almost 1,000 of whom were children and young adults under 21, as well as private facilities.
Is this nationally or just in
No,
New
this
Jersey?
was in New Jersey.
Mhm.
And despite the 1975 passage of what was then the Federal Education of All Handicapped Children Act, now IDEA, children with severe disabilities in New Jersey were segregated in day training programs, not in school. There were no family supports or employment programs, and early intervention had just begun. Individuals with disabilities other than intellectual disabilities were not eligible for services from what was then DMR. And the lecture series was begun at the request of the Department of Human Services to bring national perspectives to New Jersey as we were beginning to build capacity for community living. So again, I want to acknowledge and thank the Division of Developmental Disabilities and the Department of Human Services, as well as our federal partners, for their support and commitment to having community education available without charge.
I was wondering, Deborah,
From
what
the
role did
brochure-
Elizabeth? What role
But
did Elizabeth?
I was just going to get to our Elizabeth Boggs, who was a New Jersey resident, often thought of as either the mother or the grandmother of developmental disabilities, had a son born right after World War II when there were no services available. As a scientist, she began to interact with government officials, served on President Kennedy's panel, and was an advocate for us having a university center in New Jersey. So and I know Judy, you knew Elizabeth well, we honor her memory and her contributions by focusing today on advocacy and policy. And so it's in that spirit that I have the pleasure of welcoming Judy Heumann and Liz Weintraub. Judy Heumann has a master's public health. She's an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community. Her memoir, which I highly recommend, Being Human, an unrepented memoir of a disability rights advocate, was co-authored with Christine Jerner. Judy is featured in Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, a 2020 American award-winning documentary available on Netflix. Judy's been on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. She produces a podcast called The Human Perspective, which I also recommend and is listed on the resource list. Judy was a founding member of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, co-founder of Disabled in Action and the World Institute on Disability. And Judy served in the Obama and Clinton administrations, and she's been heavily involved in the implementation of legislation, which I know she'll talk about, as well as the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We also welcome back to New Jersey, even though she now lives in Maryland, Liz Weintraub, who has a long history of leadership and self-advocacy. She's been on many boards and advisory committees, including the President's Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities. Liz is a full-time disability staff member of the Association of University Centers for Disabilities policy team, and has a weekly broadcast, videocast called Tuesdays with Liz with Disabilities Policy for All. Liz served as a fellow in Senator Casey's office, working on disability policy. And in the fall of 2018, at the Senate Judiciary Committee, hearing on the Kavanaugh Supreme Court appointment, Liz testified, telling her personal story and sharing her experience as a woman with disabilities and the implications a Kavanaugh confirmation would have on the civil rights of people with disabilities. I'm delighted to welcome both of you. You're both unmuted, and we've shaped our discussion around the movement for disability rights, perspectives across generations. So welcome. And I'm going to ask questions, but most importantly, this is going to be a conversation between Judy and Liz. So I'm going to ask you each to tell us about your work and your life at present.
Thank you very much. Liz and I have also agreed that we're going to start off by giving our image description. So I am a white disabled woman. I live in Washington, D.C., and we are in the foyer of my husband and my apartment. So you will see the door opening and closing as some people come and go. I have brown hair, which is getting trimmed tomorrow. But today it's around my shoulder length. I have red glasses, lipstick and earrings, gold post earrings, and I'm wearing a multicolored brown blouse with different shapes, and lots of pictures on our walls and postcards. And behind you'll see a table, which at night is the dining room table, and during the day is our office.
Thanks, Judy.
And my name is Liz Weintraub. I'm really honored to be back in New Jersey among friends. I'm a short woman with glasses and black hair. I'm wearing a purplish, bluish sweater with a green blouse. I'm sitting in my black desk chair in my home office. There's pictures on the wall, and a rocking chair in the background of my screen. So
I also use a motorized wheelchair. Sorry, Liz, when you said chair, I thought, oh yeah. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, well, thank you both. Can you tell us about your work, your life right now, and your work? What are you each doing now? And I know you're doing some work together.
First, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this program with Liz. And I also want to say that Elizabeth Boggs was very special to me. I never knew her enough, but every time I met her, it was great. But what I really liked about her and Gunnar and Rosemary Dubois was the fact that they were cross disability in a meaningful way before most other people were. And that to me was very important, because when I had been working at the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, we were the first community-based CIL in the country. And we started to do work with people, or we were trying to do more work with people who had developmental disabilities, including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we were having a terrible time getting funding from the agency because we felt very much like we were not welcomed new partners. We were very much the peer support model where people with whatever disability would be involved in what was happening. And so when I met Elizabeth a number of years later, and as I said, Gunnar and Rosemary, it was a real breath of fresh air that we were really able to talk about the commonality of issues and the importance of being able to work together. So, you know, as you could tell from my resume, I'm older than Liz because I have done more things. She'll do more things when she gets to be 73. How old are you now, Liz?
54.
Yeah, so she's got like 20 years continuing accomplishments. But for myself, I think in part it's the accumulation of work that I've done domestically and internationally, which in large part has to do with personal experiences, meeting others with disabilities, and really recognizing the importance of our personal stories and how we've moved those into action. Crip Camp, I don't know, I can't see any of you. I have no way of knowing how many of you have seen Crip Camp, but I think Crip Camp is a wonderful film because it is a meaningful part of the history of the disability rights movement. For me, one of the important aspects of Crip Camp is that it should allow people to see the value of quality work, quality documentary work, but also clearly understand that it is just a part of the story. And it emanated from people who went to this same camp called Camp Jeanette in upstate New York. And I think that camp and many other experiences really, in my age cohort, was helping to formulate a movement that was based on looking at what other movements were doing and recognizing that in power, there was the ability to make change. And also the fact that really from the beginning, we were aiming at doing more and more cross-disability work. So Deborah was mentioning that I was a co-founder of an organization in New York called Disabled in Action. And Disabled in Action started in the early 70s. And as some of you may remember, Willowbrook got broken open, I think it was in 1972. And DIA got involved with the activities at Willowbrook pretty early. And that was a really good experience because we theoretically opposed institutionalization, but being able to work with parents and others at Willowbrook who are trying to help close it down was a good learning experience. Today, I would say I'm doing many things. Doing a lot of public speaking, like Liz, who does Tuesdays with Liz, as Deborah said. I'm doing a program called The Heumann Perspective, and have the 2 books that are out, and there's going to be making a movie out of my book. So I'm involved in many different avenues. And I guess one thing also is that I've been over the last couple of years speaking more about the influence of media in helping to advance knowledge about who we are as disabled people in our communities, and the absence of media or the inaccurate portrayal of disabled people in media and what impact that has on our lives.
Judy, thank you. And Liz, you're also very involved in media right now. Could you tell us some about where your life is right now and what you're doing work-wise and advocacy-wise? And then maybe I'll ask you each to then look back at what things were like quite a while ago. But Liz, tell us about life now.
Okay. I work for, as Deborah said, I work at the Association for University Centers in Disability, and I'm really proud of that. It's ironic to look back and think about that. I was during my time at New Jersey, in New Jersey, I was on the Consumer Advisory Council for the Back Center. And at that time, it was called the UAP, or University Affiliated Program. And why I'm saying that is because the AUCD is the organization that represents centers around the country, similar to the Back Center. And we also represent one program which I know New Jersey has, as well as I think you guys have a IURC, if I'm not mistaken, intellectual. No, Deborah said?
No, yeah.
Okay, that me. But anyway, what I do for the AUCD is I'm the on the policy team, as well as the host of Tuesdays with Liz. So I go up on the Hill, or I used to, before the pandemic. And I still go through a Zoom call to advocate on the Hill to our legislators about issues that we care a lot about, such as right now in the really important in the home community-based services, which is to help people to live in the community and get services in the community. And the other legislation that I'm working on is to get rid of 14C, which is the standard, the Labor Standard Act. And that's really important because people want real money for doing a job, rather than a 5 cents or 10 cents an hour, but a real paycheck. And I'm really proud to say that I have that at AUCD. I get real money from my time for working at doing what I need to be doing for AUCD. My life is I work, that's my work. And I also do a lot of other things, mentoring people. Last week, Judith and I were on a call with students from Martin College, working with people who go to college, people with intellectual disability going to college just like anyone else. And Judy was a featured speaker on one of those calls that I host on a quarterly basis for students to learn, as well as to chat about things that are important to them. That's my work. And then as well, doing speaking engagement like I am today for you. And then my personal life is I'm married. I've been married for 15 years to a wonderful guy named Phil. And we're married just like anyone else. We get services from an agency that supports us. on a weekly basis or to do different things, helping me with cooking or budgeting, whatever we need. And we also enjoy life just like anyone else to live in the community. So thanks.
Well, thank you. And I know that you travel for pleasure, not just for work. I mean, one of the things that we wanted to ask you each to do is to take us back in time a little. That we have a range of ages of people in the audience, a range of experience, and want to understand so we can keep making better futures. What was life like when you started to get involved in advocacy? Judy, you grew up in New York, as I did. You moved to California. Paint a picture what life was like. Crip Camp does some of that, but take us forward through that. It's hard for people to imagine before there was a Section 504, an ADA, or even an Education Act. What was life like for people?
So it's great that we're doing Zoom. It's terrible that I can't see anybody's face. So I would say that, I don't know the age range of your audience, but for some people who are, let's say, 40 and older, 50 and older, 60 and older, having a discussion with people about the changes they've seen even before they came into the field, I think is something worth discussing at some point. And let me just highlight some of the points that Liz has been making.
Please.
So Liz emphasizes how she is now getting a real paycheck and hasn't yet mentioned how at one point she was living in a more restricted living environment and how she basically worked with her family on changing that model. But talking to people like Liz and others older than she is and learning about their experiences, and Liz is going to talk about that, I think is very important. Also, I think if we look at the disability community overall, so when I was born in 1947 and had polio in 1949, there were no laws. There was no ADA, there was no 504, there was no IDEA, Social Security, even benefit programs for disabled people started in the 30s, really, I think, around blind people. And they were also moving forward. Some states were beginning to have legislation for what we today call home and community-based services, but that was still very limited. I think Medicaid, Medicare came into being, what, in the 60s, right? So before that,
yeah.
there was another area where I believe there was no national legislation. So one of the things, when we look for those people who are into policy, many national laws come about as a result of work that's been going on at state levels. And Section 504 and ADA and the Access Act partly demonstrate that, as states would put legislation forward on things like home and community-based services. As Medicaid came into being, there was a need for cost sharing. And so that's when you begin to see more home and community-based services program evolving. But for me, that was nothing that I ever benefited from. My mother and my father did my personal assistance services work till I went to college, when I did start hiring people to help me do some of that. In Brooklyn, New York, even though we had a very active set of organizations that were fighting for accessible transportation, for example, there had not yet been any laws that were passed at the city or state level let alone at the federal level, that would require that buses be accessible. The trains weren't accessible. So for someone who had my disability when I was 18 months old, was denied the right to go to school because they used a wheelchair and was considered to be a fire hazard, opportunities for employment were, I think, in many ways similar to what exists for certain communities of people with disabilities. So the expectation of disabled people working and choosing a career that they would go into was something that was much more limited. Very few role models of people. I sued to get my teaching job in 1970, and I was the first wheelchair rider to be hired as a teacher in New York City. And this was in 1970. So education in New York City had been around for a long period of time. There was, in fact, a law at that point which made it illegal to hire people with certain physical disabilities and blindness. So there was a state law change there. 504, the Educational Handicapped Children's Act, both of those provisions of law had support from various organizations. And I would say when you looked at the Educational Handicapped Children's Act, it didn't really have support from disability organizations that dealt with people who had their disabilities later. And one big issue, I think, was when I left Brooklyn to go to California to become involved with the Center for Independent Living, and also to attend graduate school at Berkeley. One thing that was clearly made aware to me, that if you were like Liz and myself, having had your disability when you were younger, we had a certain set of experiences of denial of equal education. But if you were older, like 15 and older, and you acquired your disability then, you had no idea what we were talking about when we talked about segregated education, because it was not a part of their experiences. So one thing for me that was really valuable was when I went from Brooklyn to Berkeley and got involved with the Center for Independent Living, and a number of my friends from New York moved out to California, and all of us had had our disabilities either from birth or very early on. We really infused a larger component of work into what CIL was doing, including working with people who had intellectual disabilities. Because again, this older group of people who had spinal cord injuries and other forms of disabilities really didn't know any people who had intellectual disabilities. Everything was very compartmentalized. But for example, the classes that I went to school, when I finally did get to go to school, the students all had some form of a physical disability. Most of them had cerebral palsy. Many of them had speech disabilities, and some of them also had intellectual disabilities. So it was a group of my friends who I was with for like 4 years when I went to high school, and I was in kind of a mixture of segregated homerooms and integrated regular classes. Then the population of students changed. All of this to say that it is really valuable, I think, for the question that we've been asked, to reflect on where we were and where we are now. So I would say, looking between 1975 and 1990, with the advancement of Title V of the Rehab Act, which includes Section 504, EHA, and ADA, we've seen some very important changes. One of them is the development of a stronger disability rights movement. And I think, thanks to people like Bob Williams and others who recognized the importance of what are called self-advocates. And Liz and I have had a discussion about this because I have a concern that the word self-advocate should maybe no longer be used because
Do I?
yes, exactly, yeah. Because I think it makes a distinction and it's a labeling that's negative. I don't want Liz and I to be seen any differently. We're both advocates and I'm as much a self-advocate as she is. But the term self-advocacy, I also think is limiting because we advocate beyond ourselves. We're advocating within our communities. And I think it was well-intentioned when the word came down, but it was more for non-disabled people because disabled people were absent in those crowds. So it was like, oh, where are the self-advocates? Invite them in. And I think there's, value that happened, of course. But at the end of the day, I think because there are organizations now that are doing, that are being led by people with intellectual disabilities, they need to be called disability rights organizers, advocates, no distinction. So there are some very important changes that have been made, deinstitutionalization, greater inclusion, more work going on in employment. And I think definitely in the DD community, many more options around supported employment programs and things of that nature. But there are huge gaps, which we'll get into talking about. But at the end of the day, I think in relationship to this discussion today, I would say one of the most dramatic changes has been that the voices of people with developmental disabilities are much more prominent than they were in the past. But like I think voices of disabled people, overall, nowhere near where we need to be.
Thanks. Do you think the word, and Liz, I'll post this to you as you reflect back, do you think self-advocate was a way of saying this is a person with an intellectual disability? Do you think that was kind of a code word for that?
Yes. Yes, I think so. And I won't fault anyone.
I agree.
Because I think that people were trying to make it better than the words duh. And I'm going to just use the formal name, even though I hate the name, the two names, but just for your audience. I'm not sure whether our audience would know them, but I hate the word retarded or the word kind. And those words really bothers me. The C word really makes me, it feels like a dentist is filling into my teeth. When you go into a dentist's office. But I think I do agree with Judy. I think it's very damaging to us. I think it separates us. And I was thinking about a student that Judy and I talked to last week, because as I said, one of the things I work on is working with students from the Think College program, and we're very excited about those that network. And I don't know whether New Jersey has a program like that. But someday, if you don't do it now, I would love New Jersey to have one. And but one of the students that actually I'm really proud that the student, it was her idea to bring Judy on to this call. And I'm using, she was saying during the conversation, she said, I'm not a self-advocate. I'm an advocate just like you are. And but my friends who I grew up with, who I think of as mentors, love that name. And some of them are two of them are my dearest friends, and who has helped me in so many ways. I can't even tell you. One of them spoke in this lecture, probably I don't know when, in the 80s. But anyway, she has said, oh, if you take away the term self-advocate, it will be like taking away our right to be at the table. Yes, I understand that we have earned the right to be at the table. We have fought to be at the table. And in some ways, Gigi kind of paved the way with her friends. And I remember seeing that in Crip Camp, where you talk about it, about, I don't want you to talk if you don't understand what I'm trying to say. So I understand what she's saying, that we have earned the right to be at the table, but in some ways we can't stop there. We need to be saying we're an advocate. I'm an advocate just like anyone else. And if you're putting me into a box saying self, that's, yes, I am a self-advocate when I talk to my husband about where I want to travel, or what I wanted to eat, or even when I talk to my boss about what I need for my job. I mean, money or what I want to do. But when I'm on the Hill, when I'm talking about 14C, or when I'm talking about home community-based services, I'm not a self-advocate. I'm an advocate, and I have to be an advocate.
I really appreciate this, and in the Q&A, some things have come up about person first language that I'll bring up later. But Liz, I want to fill in a kind of the parallel to Judy's early experience in terms of understanding your early experience. I know you were born in Virginia, your family.
I was actually born in New Jersey.
Oh,
I grew up in Virginia because we moved to Virginia when I was almost 5. I grew up there in my junior year of high school. I got tired of people calling me names, the awful name that I just talked about. I came home yelling at my parents, and that's a nice way to put it. I could use stronger words, but I won't. So they sent me to a boarding school in Cape Cod. It was a sacred school, and for me to say that it was the best school of my life is a really big honor, because it was a way that I felt like I belonged. And to this day, I still have friends there. I love that school. I'm very excited about what the school is trying to do. And then when it came to my time to go to college, every parent got time to talk to the principal and the headmaster about what to do after school. All my friends got to go to a post-secondary education program. Leslie or Theshel or NYU, but you know where they recommended to my parents, they recommended a community-based program in New Jersey. It was they called it a community-based program. It was actually a private institution. I won't name, but I'm assuming your audience will know where I'm talking about. And the second day I got there, I knew that I hated that school, that place. I actually stayed there for 9 years, despite the fact that my parents really wanted me to go back where I'm living right now, exactly where I'm living right now. But the reason why I stayed there was because I truly believe that if I didn't do what my parents wanted me to do, like going home and coming where I am right now, I would not be who I am today. One story I wanted to share with you is, so I knew that I didn't like it, and they moved me to what was called a community supported living program. And I still was not happy because it was under their rules and their guidance. And I said to my friend, and I'll use her name as Sally, and I said, Sally, you tell my parents that I'm unhappy. You're my DSP, so you tell them that. And she said, nothing doing, nothing. I will not. I'll help you. I'll hold your hand. I'll support you. I'll do whatever you need. And so I finally told them. And when they came up and told me and asked me, I ran back and forth from the car. I ran back and forth from the car. I said, no, I don't want to go. Yes, I do want to go. No, I won't go. Because the reason why I was nervous was because I felt like if I didn't do what they wanted me to do, they would leave me and they would forget about me and they would not be my friend. I can tell you, I can tell you that's the furthest from the truth, because my parents are both dead, but till they died, they were two of my best supporters, two of my best advocates, and I miss them to this day. But I can tell you that New Jersey, besides the Buck Center, which I was on the Consumer Advisory Council. The New Jersey was a horrible time in my life.
And I want to say a couple things about language. Language evolves in all communities. And I'm not a linguist, but you don't have to be a linguist to know that. I think one of the issues that's been going on is that as disabled people, we're deciding for ourselves what language should be used. And I'll relate a story. Paul Marchand, who I'm sure some of you would know, he was the advocate for the ARC. He is a wonderful man, did great advocacy work. And the language that I've used over the last 50 years has always been disabled people or disabled person. And when People First language was coming in the 70s, and we started to get to know each other, we would have these discussions about how I shouldn't use disabled people. And over the years, I was finding that some of my friends with disabilities who actually were using the term disabled people were getting criticized at meetings and being told no by non-disabled people, pretty much. They shouldn't be using disabled people. They should use people first. And that's been something that's been going on really for a couple of decades now. I think starting again in the 90s and early 21st century, disabled people ourselves began looking at other communities, the women's community, the Black community, Latino, Latinx, etc. And nobody else says person who's Jewish, person who's Muslim, person who's woman. Everyone puts the primary group first. So for me, it's been my not deviating from using disabled person people like 98% of the time, but also being respectful of what other people want to call themselves. So if someone uses the term people with disabilities and they have a disability, I of course respect their language. I think though the discussion is very important. And Liz and I talked about this, oh my God, it must be 2 years ago, because it's kind of the last time we've seen each other, about the issue of self-advocate. So I think the other thing is, as our movement is growing, you know, one of the points that some people made was we needed to distinguish self-advocate, because seated at the table, certainly depending on the discussion, you wanted to make sure that you had people. Did Liz drop?
Yeah, we're gonna try to, we'll see if she ran into a tech problem. So Judy, please.
She's been frozen. Anyway. Sorry, I'm drinking some coffee.
I wish it was in person. I was giving it to you.
Yeah, I don't drink much coffee, but sometimes I need a little. At any rate, I was going to a meeting of self-advocates with the ARC. And the first question that someone asked me was, why don't you use people with disabilities? And I thought that they were going to blast me out of the room. And I explained that I use disabled people first. Disabled people because of what I just said. It's political for me. And people were like, oh, okay. So what I really realized very strongly at that point was, you know, we could sit down and have a conversation and be respectful of each other. And there was no arguing. And then when Liz and I had this discussion 2 years ago, I think that obviously means not just Liz, but other people within the community are really looking at terminology and what it means to the broader community. And I don't like things like the able disabled or all these different euphemisms that come up. Because again, I think it's non-disabled people feeling uncomfortable around disability or somehow feeling that they need to cloak us in words that will be acceptable to non-disabled people, when at the end, it's, as Lawrence Carter Long says, just say the word. And I think that's really ultimately what we're talking about.
You know, I'm so sorry that Liz is having tech problems, because Liz, and I think she's back, Liz and I were on a task force about language and terminology and when you mentioned Paul Marchand, he was concerned that if you change the terms and the term then, and forgive me for using this term, mental retardation was in law. And I know Liz was really an incredibly strong advocate and explaining, one, how hurtful that was, and two, the right to be called how you want to be called and not how somebody else
Define it.
And I have a story that I shared with when ADD, at that time it was called MR. And I think this is when Paul, when you were talking, Deborah, about Paul, this happened. I was helping them talk about changing their name, and they were getting upset and whatever. And I said, I shared this story when I was probably 9, 8. I really didn't know what I was saying, and I apologize if I'm hurting anyone's feeling. I truly did not understand. As a kid, you don't understand things. And I should have, because I come from a very nice family and whatever. Both of you know my parents. And we had a really good family friend. And I said in front of a store, the N word, and that really hurt. And she was an African American woman, and at that afterwards, when we got home, she yelled at me, and when my parents got home, they were on a trip. And they yelled at me, and they did punish whatever they did. You can imagine how punished they would treat a 9-year-old. And but the point I wanted to make by this story, and the point I do when I tell the story, that I didn't know. I didn't know. And I can imagine people that the R word is what people knew about when in the 50s, or when Elizabeth Bugs was around. I remember talking to Elizabeth the first time I met her about the R word. And but we have grown and we have learned. And so how can I have learned not to use the N word, and I will never use the N word, because, and to this day, I love a lot of people of African American But so that's the story, and they changed the when they eventually changed the word to MMIDD or whatever I think it's American Association for People with Intellectual Disabilities, and that and even the President Committee on MR, and it was that when JFK founded that. I guess Lyndon Johnson, I remember Lyndon Johnson, but I keep on thinking it was Kennedy because he founded that. Eunice asked the president to do something around people with intellectual disability. Well, they changed that term for people with disability, and not called President Committee on People with Intellectual Disabilities.
I mean, words like cripple, which we don't use that much anymore, but the word cripple is still used in the broader vocabulary frequently. It's a very negative word. It's an old-fashioned word, and a negative because of its connotation, like the word retarded. So I think what is very important is that we are having discussions about this. I also think that I get very concerned when people are afraid of saying anything and therefore do nothing, because it's very easy to get distracted. And now I'm not talking about people who I presume are on this chat today, people who either have a family member or are working in the field or both, but people who we are wanting to be able to come in and be knowledgeable and supportive, people who are working in local organizations in the community, who we are trying to really get them to look at us just like they look at their friends. So I think we're in an important period of time, and terminology is very important, but I also think actions beyond terminology is very important. And if I could just pause for a second and say that the captioning is not working on my, everything is frozen, so I can't open the Q&A to read it or put a Q in,
Okay.
and I can't get it out of my captioning, nor is it working. So
Okay.
I don't know if other people are having that problem.
Well, thank you for raising that. What's interesting, which I'll share with you from the Q&A, that this issue of language, which at some point I thought I'd bring up at some point if it hadn't arisen, has evoked a lot of questions, thoughts, and people asking whether, is it an issue of rights? Is it an issue of perception?
Yes. An issue of rights. It's the issue of right to choose what we call ourselves, not right of what other people choose to call us.
And you both are involved in different forms of communication to the public, not, beyond the disability community. Does this issue of language come up a lot in your experience?
I think it does. I think that people just don't know the word, the R word. I'll use the R word continuing on till the end of the time we're together. On the R word, I think that people think that it's funny. I think even kids think it's a funny word. It's I remember my nieces, and this was when they were little, probably 10 years, about 20 years ago. They would say, "Oh, that retarded shirt," and I would like look at them and sing, and I would look at them and say, "What? Don't you know that it's hurtful to me?" And I saw a video just a month ago from Liz Plank. If anyone knows her, it's on YouTube. And she makes the point that we hear that word all the time. Kids say that retarded, you're driving retarded, or whatever the case might be. And that might be okay for a teenager or for someone else, but for people with disability, it's really hurtful.
Do you think that is changing as people with disabilities are more included, less segregated?
I think it's changing because people like Liz and myself will stop people when they're using the wrong words.
Yes.
We correct people, we make them understand why we don't like these words. And as I said, for me, if you have a disability yourself, another example, people who have quote unquote chronic illnesses. It's been in the last couple of years that there's been more discussions with people who have chronic illnesses to look at themselves as having a disability, because there are a huge number of people and basically they do have disabilities. So you're hearing some people with quote unquote chronic illness say disabled with a chronic illness. So I think you're hearing the word disabled used, whether it's people with disabilities or disabled people or variations. I think that is definitely something which is changing, and it is changing because more people who didn't know that they necessarily could come under the umbrella of disability are recognizing it, are seeing it from a political perspective, like voting, registering people to vote, being able to look at percentages of people who did vote and party affiliations and things of that nature. There is a need for many reasons to be able to work together with more common language.
One of the things I was going to ask you both about was the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how much has that changed? Has that had an impact on who thinks of themselves or who's considered having a person with a disability or disabled person? Is it how has that changed? How were you each involved in its passage, and how has that changed life for disabled people?
You want to go first, Liz?
Sure. I think it has changed a lot. I think that people are now willing to take no for an answer. I think people are saying, I can work, I can have care. I have to say, and I forgot to say this, I don't just have a job at the AUCD. I have a career at the AUCD. And I can tell you that my husband will often say, don't use that R word because it's against the ADA. People are I think there's a very powerful tool, and a very powerful legislation, and we can do things.
Yeah. Tell me the question again.
I was asking you, you both were involved in the
ADA, got it, yeah.
the ADA,
I think-
and what was
Yeah.
life like? Share some of the concrete differences for people who may have just grown up always knowing about, the ADA was here. What are concrete differences, and what hasn't it done that it needs to do?
I mean, I think this is another area where having discussion with the audience would be very important. For me, the built environment has been very impacted by the ADA because it covers the public and the private sector. It doesn't cover housing very much, but it doesn't cover airline travel. There are a number of exclusions that I think are of note. But if we look at the ADA overall, I would say that one of the major areas is the built environment and technology. Although in technology too, there's a need for stronger regulations, clarifying regulations, but I think the law is pretty clear. So, the fact now that all buses are accessible, and if there's a problem where they've ordered buses that are not accessible, you can most likely successfully sue or complain about that. Having an accessible transit system minus airplanes is major, and it allows mobility for people, not just with disabilities, but for people with baby carriages. And I would say that that's one of the most interesting outcomes of having elevators, for example, at train stations, is looking at the lineup of 1 to 5 or 6 families with a baby carriage at the elevator to get off or on, get up or down from the platform. And I think one of the points in this aspect of the discussion is that while ADA and other laws were conceptualized looking at disability, for us, one of the important aspects of these laws is that it is normalizing things like accessibility. And I think the more we normalize and raise people's expectations of what should be. I live in an apartment building in DC. It's not condo, it's all rental. And one day, one of the older people who lived here said that they were really upset that there wasn't an electric door opener on a particular door in the building. People have gotten accustomed to these electric door openers that more and more places are using. Now, the regulations do not require an electric door opener. They require a certain level of pressure, has to be below 5 pounds. And I think what people have found is that the electric door opener benefits much more than the user with a wheelchair or someone with, braces and crutches. So the normalization of things, I think, is very important. Even things like kitchens. And when you think about beds, electric beds that sit up and legs go up, all those things originally came about because of disabled people. Siri, as an example, voice activated software, programs software for people who are blind. Much of that really started out between Department of Defense, the VA, and the Department of Education. So I think those are some of the other important changes that have been made as we enforce existing laws more. Universal design characteristics are being built in. And I think it's the same like with inclusive education. I mean, the model is not as easy as dealing with the access issue. But I think what we definitely are seeing is that as we are moving more naturally towards inclusive environments, that we are seeing people recognizing the benefit. So you see more people talking about the benefit of inclusive education when they're a family who have non-disabled children, as an example, which I think is very important.
I also Senator Duckworth from Illinois is doing a is introducing in the last Congress a bill called and I don't have the name in front of me, but it's to help all stations are accessible for public transportation, because a lot of the stations are not accessible. I know in Boston there's not a lot of elevators, or here in DC we're pretty lucky, but other stations, other states might not have that. And sometimes the elevators is broken. I know that probably 2 years ago, the executive director, at that time the associate director, now the executive director of AUCD, is a person who uses a wheelchair, and the station that is near to our office, the elevator was broken, so he was forced to work from home, which is okay. And at that time, this was pre-pandemic, so now it's fine. But before then, he needed to be at work, and he was forced to work from home, and it was very annoying to him.
Yeah, I think the issue Liz is raising also around maintenance is really important, because if all the escalators and elevators broke at the same time, they would deal with it differently. Another issue that I'm trying to deal with here in DC is they used to announce if an elevator was broken. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, my husband and friends, we went to the baseball game. We took the metro nearest to our home and we went to the game. And when we came back, obviously we went to use the same elevator, which is closest to where we live. When we got there, we found out the elevator was broken and they had made no announcement. So they used to make announcements. And while this sounds like it's very local, it's not. It's basically, if a limited number of people, in this case, disabled individuals, although also even people with baby carriages, although frequently you could just lift the baby carriage up the steps. But why they stopped doing that, I think, that's just that we're not included enough. So it didn't get to the right person when they were just letting this drop by the wayside. But I think so. Part of what we're saying is it's a lot more visibility. But I think the other thing we're raising is there is still not the degree of care and thought and inclusion of disabled people in positions. Like one of the important points that I think Liz raised a few minutes ago was, yes, she is an employee of the AUCD, but she is a professional. And I presume, Liz, you would check off the box communication. Is that right?
Yes.
You could check off advocate
Yeah,
and communication, and legislation. But one of the main areas that you work on is communication, right?
yes,
So like, both of us, we have multiple boxes that we can check off. But I think the point that Liz is making, which I think is very important, is I don't want to see people having to only look at organizations that are disabled focused as places where we can get jobs. If the ADA and 504 are working, that means that our qualifications should at least get us to the door to be interviewed, if our qualifications meet up with what the employer is looking for. And it shouldn't be that if you have certain disabilities, these are the organizations you can work in,
I remember when I was working for the Senate, and the Capitol is the people's house. When we're allowed to get back into going to the Hill in person, although somebody, a friend of mine went on the Hill for the first time last week. I don't know how. I have heard that it's still not available to visitors, but we have the right to go up on the Hill to advocate and to talk to our legislators. But the doors are so heavy. And I remember I would always struggle with the doors and the stairs. And yes, I know the building was built before ADA, but still we have the right to be there. And so I advocated for, I worked in the aging office for Senator Casey, and the door to that office, the door was so heavy, and I could barely push it. And I don't have a huge physical disability, but it was so hard for me to push it. And by the time I finished my fellowship 4 months later, we got it done. We send in the right paperwork to the architecture at the Capitol. It's so confusing, unbelievable what you have to do. And I came back to visit, and the door was lighter. It wasn't perfect, but it was still lighter. So I thought it was great.
I think that's a great, and I think presence and being there makes a difference, so that people listen. I want to respond to one of the questions, and Liz, I'll use that as a jumping off point about the Hill, about what are the pressing issues right now that are being debated in Congress that are for people, for all people, but especially disabled people. What are the implications and what are the pressing issues right now, both in Congress and maybe later some general issues? But what's going on in Congress right now?
I think there's two that I've been working on. Is and I briefly mentioned this, the home community-based services, and we, the president tried to put 400 billion with a B into his Build Back Better agenda, and I understand that's stalled in the House, and we're hoping to get less than that, probably $100 or $200 billion and I don't quite understand money, so maybe Deborah or Judy can help me with that. But anyway, we need that so people can live in the community and have and our direct support professionals, which are called DSPs for short, need to be paid a livable wage. Because they have a really important job. Some of our DSP help us getting out of bed, getting our food, whatever. I personally don't need a lot of support. If our DSP isn't here on a daily basis or a weekly basis, we're fine. My husband and I are fine. But some of my friends need that on a daily basis. The other issue that is very important is ending 14C. The sub-minimum wage. We need a livable wage. I know in the long time ago, probably in the Bucks era, 14C was okay, and working in a workshop it was fine. But I deserve a wage, a real wage, and people deserve. I do a lot of hard work at the AUCD, so I deserve to know. As I have said, and I just said this week, when I was in the institution in New Jersey, I worked in 3 different workshops. One was I did math work in a work, and they called it the office type of work, but it was doing math in a workbook that you get at a drugstore. And that was one job. The second job was working in a greenhouse. And then the third was stuffing newspapers in like a flyer that you get at a supermarket. And in all those jobs, I didn't know how much I got paid. And to this day, I probably wouldn't understand money. Money and I don't get along very well, but I understand, but I do know how much AUCD pays me. So I would think 14C and to get rid of 14C and home community-based services. The other legislation that isn't going anywhere, but we're still trying, is the Higher Education Act, and to include people with disability in that, so people can go to colleges. So maybe Judy has other ideas.
No, I think I would, in addition, first of all, Liz, I would say that you shouldn't say you're not good in money or that you're not good in math, because once we say that, people kind of discount our ability to participate in discussions. I think it was both you and I not going to regular classes. We didn't learn things like many other people did. And I also think, at least in my generation, there being an expectation that women didn't assume certain roles. So it wasn't necessary for us to learn these things because somebody else would take care of it. So I think what you do is you know what your strengths are, and you're not a good basketball player or a football player, but you might like the sports. So you don't say, I'm not a good basketball player. You say, I like to watch basketball. I just think the way we phrase things to other people is really important. And what I like very much about what you discuss around money is you know what you know and you know what you don't know. And you bring people in to help you make sure you're doing it the right way, which is exactly what I do. So
Yeah.
I think it's very important. For me, what I would say on issues that are important is that voting rights is critical. And absolutely 14C that Liz is talking about regarding being able to pay people below minimum wage is something that definitely has to be gotten rid of, and it slowly has been, but the value of getting legislation to end the ability to pay below minimum wage, I think is crucial, regardless of the number of people who are still in those settings getting below minimum wage, because it speaks to our perception of the value of the people performing work. And again, what Liz is discussing is we are doing work that we need to be paid for. And that's, I think, the bottom line. Once you say it's okay for a disabled person, even if you're sending somebody out to make a determination to earn below minimum wage, it continues to put forward a perception that it's okay to treat us less than equal. And then on the issue of home and community-based services, Liz, again, I wouldn't say that you don't know money, because the bottom line is there still is no legislation that's been passed because there are arguments going on about how much money should be in the legislation. So one of the areas that I'm working on with Liz is in the area of home and community-based services. So as Liz said, the initial proposal from the Biden administration is $400 billion. Now, that provision, like other provisions, are being looked at to be reduced. And I think the case that we're trying to make is, what is home and community-based services? What is its value? One of the proposals that I think is floating is, and this is not just related to home and community-based services, but for example, home and community-based services right now in the proposal, the funding would go for 10 years, guaranteed for 10 years. But let's say you reduced it to 7 years. That would reduce the overall amount of money that needed to be allocated now, but it still could contain all of the other provisions, namely, or some of which, as Liz was also saying, paying appropriate wages for workers. It also addresses the issue of getting rid of wait lists, Medicaid wait lists, which is very important. So I think we're playing around now with what is going to go on and what are we going to ask for as minimum, but definitely it's not going to come out at 400 billion. But I just want to end on, what I started with, which is, I think voter suppression is so critical that everyone, regardless of whether you are living in a state, and I don't think New Jersey is one of the states that's been pushing through very harmful legislation, but there are many states. And in my view, people with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, and developmental disabilities, and other forms of more significant disabilities will definitely be a group of people who will lose their right to vote because of all the restrictions that are being put in place. So I think as the disability rights community, we need to understand, for me, one thing I've been so concerned about for years is that people don't understand what the Congress does. So people don't understand who nominates people and who appoints people for the Supreme Court. And getting back again to what Liz did, that excellent testimony that she did when now
Judge Kavanaugh.
Yeah, Kavanaugh. She brought up a very important case about a woman who had an intellectual disability and a right to have an abortion, right?
Yes.
And I think her argument was so important. Now, if most people don't understand that the president nominates, and it is the Senate, not the House, the Senate that confirms for the Supreme Court and for other federal judges, you know, we have a legitimate right to be very concerned about how the courts are going to fare over the next. I mean, these people serve in their positions for life. So, you know, cases like people being able to get out of nursing homes with Olmstead, you know, there could be changes in court decisions that could really adversely affect many of the areas that people on this Zoom have worked very hard for. So for me, it's voting rights, voting rights, voting rights, because that is something that we have to always be concerned about. Home and community-based services and 14C are issues we have to be concerned about and work very hard on. And if we've done good work, I believe, with voting rights, that also means that if we can get people to understand why voting is so important, then we can also get them to understand why, if people contact them and say, if you believe in community-based services, call your senator. This is why it's important. If people don't understand the connection, and now I'm not talking about disabled people, I'm just talking in general, then they don't participate. And I think that's really the issue of participation. Knowledgeable.
And
Sorry, Liz.
I would also add, Judy, I think that voting is really important, and I couldn't agree with you more. But a lot of the time people will say to people with developmental disability, or at least they will tell me, oh, you really shouldn't vote for this. Oh, you shouldn't do this. You don't understand. Well, yes, we do. If you explain things to us in plain language, and that's why Tuesdays is around, because we help people to understand what home community-based services or why voting is important or whatever. Then we can understand. I can tell you that I can tell you about the Kavanaugh case because someone explained it to me. Gigi just did, so I won't go into that. But I have done it before, just recently, where someone said, what was the Judge Kavanaugh case all about, or why do you be a witness in the Kavanaugh case? I explained that, and I can say that 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whenever it was.
I also want to say here, Liz, many of the issues that you're raising, other people don't understand either. And so, you know, the point that you continue to make is just explain it to me. And people think it's like, oh, you've got a developmental disability, therefore you need an explanation. But I guarantee you just like when we were talking about money. That is wrong. Most people do not understand the complexities of these issues, not because they can't, but because a lot of it is written in language of lawyers. It's written in a way that the average person really doesn't understand. So when ASAN came out with their easy language on Medicare or Medicaid, I read it and I was like, we need to explain that we shouldn't be looking at this as something for someone who, it will benefit people, but it benefits a much larger group. It is the whole concept of universal design. And I think once we only think about, things being said in an understandable way as something which has benefited, a benefit for people who people believe are less intelligent, then I think it doesn't bring the point across. I guarantee you, if you took a group of average non-disabled people and you gave them the Kavanaugh case and the way it came out and the way you explained it, they would understand what you said and they would have no idea what came out in the other language. So I think, easy to read or, language that the average person can understand. That's really the objective for everything, really.
Well, and I think that, thank you. What we've just been talking about is really responsive to a lot of the questions in the chat. And what you're talking about making things understandable also relates to issues that have been raised, in the Q&A about support. And Liz, you talked about a friend supporting you to speak to your parents, but some general questions been raised about who is your supporters? How does peer support enter into the things that you're talking about? What kinds of supports do people want and need in their lives?
I think the best way to support someone is to ask what I need. You can't just assume parents or family members will say to me, oh, I know what you want. I know what you need. This. But how do they know that I need that? How do they know that I want that? I may not want to. One of the things, a story that I'll share with you about when I was in the institution, and this was many years ago. They said to get out of the institution, I needed to learn how to cook. Well, I needed to learn how to cook. Well, I didn't want to cook. I didn't like to cook. And so my idea was to do TV dinners.
I heard exactly what I was going to say, Liz.
a TV dinner, and I did that till the day that Phil and I moved in together. He threw it away because he didn't like TV dinners. And so, he likes to cook. I let him cook.
You like
and
to,
I'm just learning how to cook just because I should. Because in case he gets sick or whatever.
It would have been good to turn back the clock. And for everybody who said you need to cook, I would ask them, well, you cook me a meal and let me see if you cook to my standards. It's like these ridiculous things. I think in response to this, what do you need? Obviously, what Liz said is exactly what I would start with. You need to ask the person. And that's not just someone who has a disability, disability or not. I think in the area of disability, where it goes beyond. So, hypothetically, for me, I would say I need this many hours of personal assistance, and I don't know how to get it. So the ability to have someone who knows the system better than I do, because really, some of these systems, as you know very well, are quite complex. And again, it's not just the issue of, do you have an intellectual or developmental disability? The issue is the complexity of an issue, and how, if you've studied in the field, you know much more than the average person. Well, would you be eligible for this program or that program? Or in many cases, you may not even know, but you may know people to call. So listen to what the person says. And I would say additionally, sometimes we, I can't speak for Liz, but I presume this is true too. Like for someone like myself, you look at what is the minimum that I need in order to be able to get through the day. This is my minimum. But if I could think above my minimum, what would that look like? And I think that discussion is very important. Can also be informed by someone who knows you and can have a discussion with you, again, whether you have a disability or not, to be able to think potentially bigger or smaller about what it is you're wanting, and to help you both, where it's possible, learn to be able to be a decision maker, or learn to be able to work with a supportive group to make those decisions. But the center is talk to the person. And I think really it's also help the person learn more about what is possible. Because I think if we only ask for what we think is possible, like if you live in an institution, or if you're institutionalized where you're living because you can't get out because no elevator or whatever it may be, your vision of what you want and need can be much smaller than what it should be. And even comparing it to a typical other person, how much less are you looking at in order to be able to live an equivalent life?
And I would also add, reach for the stars. Reach for the stars. And I'll leave you with this one example about reaching for the stars is, and this is going back to jobs, what people want to do. I, when I was probably 18, 19 years old, my parents were probably very forward-thinking people, said to me, what do I want to do? And I think I was home from New Jersey one day or whatever, and I said, I wanted to be a lobbyist. And I don't even know what I was thinking or what a lobbyist was. And it must not have been before New Jersey because I was 17 or 18. And I said, and my parents kind of laughed in my face. Like it was the funniest thing. And so I went to New Jersey and I got a job in the library and I was happy and whatever. And look at where I am today. I am working. I don't have a paper because it's not being a lobbyist isn't what I want. Isn't right for me or for AUCD, but I am a lobbyist because I am going up on the hill to talk to legislators. And
you're a policy analyst.
Yeah, I'm a policy analyst. So never give up.
I think this is such a great story. It's like, when I wanted to be a teacher, people ask me why. I honestly, Liz, don't know when that really emerged, but it was something that I wanted to do. And of course, everyone was like, oh no, that's not going to happen. I think it's particularly true with younger people, to allow them not to get pigeonholed into what other people think they can do. And it really is enabling people to get appropriate exposure. And maybe we can be ending a little bit on how we started, which is the role of media. You know, I think one of the powerful parts about the programs that Liz and I do is that they allow people to learn about people they probably knew nothing about, or maybe a little about. And I think it helps people expand their knowledge. And at the end of the day, that's really what we want to do, is have people learn about different things. And I guess in summary for this entire program, it's respect the fact that the field is dramatically changing. Look at the role that you are playing. Are you playing a positive or negative or neutral role? And after today's session, what are you going to go back and do differently?
Thank you. Liz, any other thoughts in closing?
Just, I would say, believe in people with disability. Believe in people with disability and help people, walk alongside people.
Judy, anything else?
What can I say after that?
Right.
You might not walk next to us, but you can roll next to us.
Yeah, yes.
Good
Well,
job.
the only thing I can say after that is to thank you, both for your being with us today, for your leadership, for the ways that you teach us through different mediums, through your presence and your warmth and caring. So we're honored by your presence, and we're
honored to be here, right, Liz?
Yes.
I think this is the fourth event that Liz, or at least fourth event that Liz and I have done together over the last year and a half, and it's been great for me.
Yes, it has been.
Thank you all. Judy, Liz, thank you for being here, for your friendship. Elizabeth Boggs, I think, is smiling down on us. And again, thank you to DDD, to Administration Community Living, and for our audience for being with us today. Be well, everyone, and we hope you'll participate in the other series. And we will look forward to Judy's biopic, again, having people see Crip Camp, and it's only 4 more days till Tuesdays with Liz. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being with us today and marking this milestone for the Boggs Center. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.